Here is part 2 of Alexey Arestovych's interview to Yulia Latynina on day 717 of Russian invasion of Ukraine. So here's the question. What is the West fighting for, if they're still fighting for something? Right now, you mean? Yeah, right now. Not giving aid to Ukrainian soldiers that are fighting for Avdiivka at the moment. You mean an honest answer? Is that what you're looking? Yeah, I do. Well, first, I think that Western politicians are not really fighting for anything besides the votes of their electors. That's one of the main features of democracies these days. Let's raise the plank higher. What do they need the votes for? To come to power, to stay in power. What do they need power for? Power for every politician is the value in itself. Well, okay, so he got power. What next? Then he likely will enjoy it and will be sharing the pie till the next electoral cycle. Here's the difference of democratic politicians from political leaders. Right, you just called Western politicians scammers with a very low-grade philosophy who sacrifice their values and the values of others for their own power. Yeah, that's what they do, generally. Well, that's a sentencing to the West. Look, what it looks like from outside. And that's what, it's your words. You basically said that these are low-level scammers who are just intending to get a share of the pie and have a chance at sharing it. We're not taking real political leaders in this case. Now let's take Prince Salman from Saudi Arabia, who is accused of dismemberment of a journalist, Khashoggi. And he says, fellas, I have a dream. Alexey, sorry to interrupt you here. I'm not going to break you here. We'll return back to Salman, of course, Prince Salman. But I'm generally against dismemberment of people in embassies. But every time I hear when Mr. Khashoggi is called a journalist, he was actually a columnist in Washington Post. He was a very influential Salafite. So a member of Muslim Brotherhood, one of the leaders of Muslim Brotherhood in Saudi Arabia. So he was not just a political opponent of Prince Salman, but he was basically like Vladimir Lenin back in the early 20th century Russia. And if Vladimir Lenin would be publishing columns in Washington Post, and it probably would be a similar situation. And if Tsarist powers would have done something with Lenin, it would not be correct to claim that they've done something with a journalist, right? It was a political figure. Right. I worded it the way that Washington Post and other newspapers talk about that while calling him a journalist. So when he was attacked and killed, Salman became a very controversial person then. That's being shunned by many leaders and many other officials. So he's essentially a leader in his country who said that we'll do all the technological and other changes, we'll reach for the new highs. There was a recent publication in EU. Saudi Arabia, by the way, when they heard about a museum Bergamon closing in Berlin for 10 to 15 years to be refurbished and repaired, and Saudi Arabia said, let us take that museum in. We'll host it for these years in its entirety. So now they're putting their value into pushing our civilization further. And now let's compare them with the Western leaders. We have evil tyrants, as they're presented by the Western media. In Saudi Arabia, there are no elections, right? And we have people's democracy in the United States that is literally just giving up the Ukrainian soldiers and Ukraine when they've given up on Iraq and before that Afghanistan in the same fashion. So whom would a smart man prefer out of these two? The West? The West. Why? Because when I come to Saudi Arabia, I depend entirely on the will of Prince Salman. He most likely will allow women to drive cars, and I'll have some rights there too. And same thing when I go to Russia. I'm not going to in the near future, but I do depend on the will of President Putin or some local bureaucrat. And there is no fighting against it. But when I come to Ukraine or when I come to the West, I am to some degree in a legal society where there is still justice system and I can still stand for myself. All right, fantastic. Now, where is that good, positive fella whose name is Peterson? Sorry, who's that? A famous psychologist, one of the right side figures, one of the right side leaders. He's a conservative fellow, a professor of Canadian University who wrote several very popular books, bestsellers. His name is Jordan Peterson, a publicist, a well-known figure. He was forbidden to teach in his university, and they tried to take away his YouTube channel as well. He clashed with the professor circles of Toronto that are betting on radical feminists, and he tried to explain that it's not even about genders and sexes, but it's about meritocracy, rather, that it should be the best working system. And he was cancelled, essentially, in his country, that he had to change his whole life. So in Ukraine, we have a very similar story, where by reports of their colleagues or students, a lot of professors were left without means to existence. And many of them left the country, and they're reinventing their lives again. For me personally, I don't care who was that who left the professor without means to existence, whether it's government force or Trotsky's threats, informers among his students. The result is the same. He is left without means to existence and cannot teach. Different mechanisms, but the story is about the same. On one hand, it's students and colleagues. It's not done by government officials. But again, what do you mean by not done or not interference by the federal officials? Of course they do in some degree. My favorite example, last year in Russian Federation, 400 plus were jailed for posts on Facebook and likes. In Britain, 3,300 suffered repercussions for different posts. It's about 8 times more, right? I also remember in Ukraine, there was some old lady, 65-year-old, got some, there were 220 cases in Ukraine. So we're generally somewhat a democracy, I guess, in this regard. Twice less than in Russia and 15 times less than in Britain. And let's talk about crypto mechanisms of repression. Once we're on this topic, when we are saying that in Russia it's federal authorities that are repressing people in Russia, I have my first knowledge from friends in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, some acquaintances, they're saying that teachers on different universities, they are not really too ashamed to cuss Putin and do it in the open in their teachers' meetings. And they're not somehow repressed. In the meantime, recently we had a news from Harvard, right? When there was a joke that Hamas lost 2 leaders, that Israel has killed one in Beirut, and another rep of theirs was fired from Harvard, who said that the genocide of Jews depends upon the context, right? Trotskyism won, but in both, in the United States and in Soviet Union. Both countries have lost. It's just the speed of these losses were different. Soviet Union was caught in 91, and the United States are catching fire finally now. And the mechanisms of repression, they do exist. And I would say very often in the West, it is being done via the academic societies, via radical public groups. Where is that police officer who killed that black fella a couple years ago? Killed in jail? No, what do you mean killed? He's still alive. Hang on, let our listeners chime in. I think there was an attack on him, but I think he's still alive. I think he's as good as dead now, Yulia, about a month ago. And Navalny, I do sympathize with him as a political leader who is constantly being harassed in prison. He is still alive, however, and that policeman is dead. And I'm not turning to us, but to our viewers. If the person is not murdered by the federal forces, it doesn't mean that he will not be assassinated, right? And we're just getting the news, by the way, Yulia, that Zaluzhny is terminated from his position by Zelensky. Wow, okay. And I just wanted to correct here quickly that Derek Chauvin, he was actually indeed stabbed 22 times in jail. And as far as I understand, he is still alive. But yeah, let's wrap up with Derek Chauvin. I think we went in a slightly different direction here about systemic things. Let's go back to Zaluzhny. One more thing before we go to Zaluzhny. I want to conclude that. I want to say that in the West, there is a more perfected and way more perfected than in Russia or in the East, the mechanism of separation and punishment of those who are deemed guilty. Very often it's just people with their own opinion, different from the one liked by the government. The fact that it's done not by the government, that this is used by other mechanism, this is just a perfected mechanism. In Russia, it is Putin's government that harasses people. In the West, it's a much more perfected mechanism. It's easier for the government when his own colleagues stifle the person with unpopular opinion in their circles. It's cleaner and for them. So it's the same system, though. Now I'll go back to Zaluzhny. He is a leader. He's a political leader in Ukraine. According to recent polling, he wins over Zelensky in any voting that was done before he was fired. And it's not the main thing. The main thing is that he has the status of the people's idol. This is an example of our immature thinking, but in general, it exists. And this firing only gives him more popularity. So since now, he became a political leader after his resignation. Now, every step that he takes will be under a lot of scrutiny. And he has, of course, a lot of people who will be attacking him. And those many of them will be shaking his hands and smiling and saying that he's a savior of the nation. But there'll be others who will be supporting him, who will be offering their friendship, their wallet, and their aid. And I think this is a beginning of a much larger political career for him, and with much wider, broader capabilities than his previous position of commander-in-chief afforded him. So unless some black swan happens, he definitely will remain in the political spectrum. Zelensky failed to resist that temptation to fire him. He should have established better connections and bring him with him, continue the work together, but he decided to separate, to part ways. So I can wish good on both sides and see what happens. Do you think something happens with the front now? Not so important. The case about resignation of commander-in-chief, if we even speak without last names, it's not so important, the act itself. The most important is who is going to be the next commander-in-chief. Because if the next one will be put in place with another team, or even alone, if the strategy will becomes more effective, then Zelensky, or okay, we're talking without last names, Supreme Commander-in-Chief did everything fine, did everything correct. Because every time when Supreme Commander relieves Commander-in-Chief from his position, this is an acknowledgement of a change of strategy or ineffective strategy. So it needs to become more effective, it needs to change, otherwise it will be read by everybody as political attack. Even if initially he had a different vector and Zelensky indeed wanted to change something in armed forces and make it more effective, it would still be read as political assassination of his opponent, and it will be a biography fact of a new commander, Supreme Commander and Commander-in-Chief, the new one coming and the resigned one. So we'll see if it will become better in terms of strategy or worse. But the fact that Valery Zaluzhny just made a step into big politics 15 minutes ago, that is for sure. This is the beginning of a new career. The position is dead. Long live the position. Long live the new position. So the article by Zaluzhny in CNN, give me drones and I'll hold the front, with even minimal support of the West. Do you think you'll have enough drones, UAVs, all these systems? Is it possible? Well, I do not see them in large numbers. We'll see, I guess. Well, it is politicians and industrial complex that are responsible for the drones, right? So they can probably somehow get them. Well, army indeed is only responsible, Yulia, for fighting the war. Everything else is responsibility of politicians. And more than that, I would say army is not even responsible for mobilization. It's on the president and legislature of Ukraine. Army is only responsible to train those people that were given to it and use them effectively on the front. All right, so Zelensky fired Zaluzhny, and I think we will not be wrong if we suspect that the trust ratings are among the leading causes to that event, because he definitely is higher in that metric than Zelensky. And it will not be a good scenario for Zelensky if something fails on the front after. I think he created also another risk, a huge political competitor. Yeah, he just did. He indeed just created one. All right. But criminal prosecution against Zaluzhny was in March of 22. Yeah, since the 4th of March. That's when it was started for treason against Zaluzhny. Against Zaluzhny himself? Yes, against Zaluzhny himself and several other generals. When he was commander-in-chief, we should not be talking about that. You knew about that. I was delicately keeping it quiet, but you confirmed that, and I'm reaffirming after you. Every congressman in Ukraine can send a request, an inquiry, and get the answer to that question if they're interested. And in April of 23rd, he was also added. They added another attack on him. They added another criminal article, criminal neglect, that led to death of more people. Imagine him conducting counteroffensive operation while him and his other generals were being dragged to interrogations by investigative committee. The criminal prosecution is still active. That is still ongoing, so I don't know how that will be exploited. But for the most part, Zelensky administration is afraid of connection between Zaluzhny and Poroshenko. And you can see that there is a serious attack on Poroshenko going on now. Will he be prosecuted further? Well, I think that's one of the levers that Zelensky administration still has against him. Well, we see that there were other generals. There was Krivonos, who was under investigation for, as I understood, volunteer defense of airfield. Then there was Chiginsky, who was investigated and prosecuted for unsuccessful operation, which looks rather weird in my civilian eye. What did Zaluzhny do in 10 days to get a case in March of 22 on treason? Well, somebody was supposed to be appointed as a responsible party for the preparedness for the war that we had and for the failure in the south. Look, let's be sober here all of a sudden. First of all, criminal prosecution doesn't say that you are guilty. Only court can determine that. And by the fact of such a failure in the south and all that was happening at the beginning of war, some investigation should have been done, right? Alexey, let me interrupt you here. Should there have been a criminal prosecution against some generals in Britain when Germany attacked it successfully at the beginning of war? This is a very Soviet-style thing when the government drags generals and executes them summarily. Even Napoleon didn't have that. Right. Well, we have what we have. We had a criminal case. We were dragging generals under investigation and spoiling their life at the moment when they were throwing all their efforts to defend the country. If nothing will come out of it, then it'll be just a criminal prosecution case that was started, and they discovered that the generals are not guilty. And now we have a fact that a person who was fired by the president is now under criminal investigation, and he's an opposition or a strong politician figure. probably in opposition to Zelensky. And this is the current political setup in Ukraine. All right, Alexey, there were rumors that at the beginning of war, Zelensky and Zaluzhny had some fallout between themselves. I don't know about that. I would not confirm that. I think, in my view, that their system of relations is a ongoing misunderstanding, 2.5 years long. What specific one people referred to when they said at the beginning of war, I don't know. It seemed like a continuous thing. All right, then a question is, who is responsible for giving up the South? As I understand, it was difficult to defend South, and especially if civilians thought that there will be no war and did not allow the army to build any fortifications. Well, Yulia, maybe you don't know, as many of our viewers, that military in Ukraine still have to ask with local authorities if they want to dig a trench or any fortification. It's could be in a town that maybe is 10 to 20 kilometers away from the front line, but it's already half leveled, in rubble, in ruins. And first they need to find those authorities, and then they need to ask that permission. Otherwise, there'll be investigation against them. And if they're not doing that, then local prosecutors come and saying, oh, you forgot to ask the question. You forgot to get permission. Here's a criminal case against you. Boom. Our military is really in a bad position right now. When some news that I get from my officers on the front, I don't know whether to cry or to laugh. They cannot discipline their subordinates because we were tried to be too humane before the war. In Israel army, commander can use his sidearm against cowards, and sometimes even has to. In American army, they can too, and Ukrainian army, the officer cannot do anything. Okay, so the weapon option is taken, then the mechanism for evacuation should be worked out to be easier. So you don't keep those who are demoralizing your detachment in there for too long. And we're still failing to do that on the third year of war. Well, now we're getting the replacement of Commander-in-Chief, even though most of these things are not his direct responsibility. And mostly it's the Minister of Defense in terms of paperwork, real rights of commanders and other front officers. That's probably to the Supreme Commander and legislature again. So we'll see. New Commander-in-Chief will have a bunch of levers to use, and we'll see how effective he'll be in doing that work. And Valery Zaluzhny can now be giving interviews in this regard and express his point of view. Right now, he'll be pulled apart for different political statements, even the most loyal correspondents to the power in Ukraine. And he'll start making different steps. Some of them will be successful, good. Others will be maybe not so successful, like every person. But he'll be conducting some sort of political action. And the thing is that the middle-class Ukrainian bureaucracy is usually looking towards the winner, always. And one day our Supreme Commander may find out that nobody is listening to him anymore, de facto, because everybody already jumped ship to the camp of the new politician. And what happens then? The country is fighting a war. Will Commander-in-Chief still manage to hold the situation? New Commander-in-Chief, whoever it will be, will have to fight for loyalty of our troops. And I have certain doubts in his capability to do that. And you're asking if it is a present for Putin? No, it's not. It's inner Ukrainian squabbles, political decisions internally. I also know one more person who started having a lot of issues with his life the moment his rating became second to President of Ukraine. Oh, that's right, Alexey. I'm talking to him right now. What this story tells us, like Suvorov, the famous commander, said, one time is luck, second time is luck. When is it mastery and not luck, right? Well, I want to say here, Alexey, that these are the questions I was asking of you, and you tried to evade them. Because I was posting, look, there is Putin, who already lost by the fact of beginning this war, because he totally destroyed that connection that existed between Russians and Ukrainians, because his intention was to fortify that link, and he completely failed in doing so. Then there is West, that we have dissected already 7 ways to Sunday, and there are also Ukrainian powers that are making a bunch of systemic errors. And here we can say that there's West that observes Russia, proverbial murder in this case, but they also see what's happening in Ukraine, the processes that are ongoing, which in Russia are probably at the end already of that way, and in Ukraine they're just at the beginning. But they are all about destroying the opponents, their political opponents, in essence. And I want to postulate that if at the beginning of war, Ukraine was perceived as a democracy fighting dictatorship in Russia and will hold Russia in its tracks, but now the West may be coming to realization that now they have to hold both Russia and Ukraine, because regardless of whether they're good or bad, there are two parts of Soviet Union after it fell apart. And let's ask, who wants to see Russia in European Union? The answer is nobody. Are you effing nuts? But I'm also not sure if Ukraine is desirable to be in EU by EU members with all the processes that are happening there. Even though we in Russia can only be envious of the versatility of political life still available in Ukraine. Even what is happening between Zaluzhny and Zelensky, this is a natural situation when in a democratic country, power cannot be concentrated in one hands, and there is always somebody around whom all the opposition aggregates, and the president, on the other hand, is trying to struggle with that. In Russia, you don't have that, really. Well, Yulia, when Prigozhin was marching towards Moscow and Putin fled and people saluted Prigozhin in his march, well, that's a bit different, Alexey. Let's not compare Zaluzhny with Prigozhin. This is not the right comparison, and it's not pretty in regards to Valery Fedorovich. No, I'm not comparing these two figures. I'm comparing the situation. We can do that without last names. So there was a politician who was growing fast. His public rating was growing. Then he created a armed march towards Moscow. He failed to execute it to its finality, and then he died as a result of it, right? And now they have Nadezhdin, for example, right? Another politician who is trying to assert some resistance. Well, let's start from the beginning. Putin did not try to make anybody in Ukraine Russian, because he's not representing Russians. He is representing citizens of Russian Federation, and that's a big difference. The whole war occurred, in my opinion, because there are not enough Russians in Ukraine and in Russia. Those Russians who somehow take their roots from the Kievan Rus. That's where they find answers to what Russians are. If Putin represented Russians, this war would have not happened. And when he's representing Russian Federation and its ruling party, that's when the war happens. The next moment, mistakes made by Ukraine. You understand, we make mistakes. That's true. And they only lower our efficacy on the front. That's the only thing that they do. They are not reasons to act for Putin or an instrument. They neither are a cause or an instrument for the West as well. The West is not really holding anybody. They have no strategy in this war. They generally have no strategy. They've lost their ways, and it doesn't seem like they're acquiring it again. So the events are unfolding rather haphazardly, and the only one who understands the next steps and has some reality is the global South in this case, I think. China. Perhaps Iran, North Korea, and Russian Federation, and Syria, and Hussites together as a joint group. And the new countries that are joining BRICS, Saudi Arabia, Arab Emirates, the West doesn't have a strategy. The only country in the West that has some strategy are Brits. They are still grown-up adults in the room in the West who are still continuing their strategy. United States, unfortunately, not so much. So with this, that I think I can agree with. All right. That changes everything by 180 degrees, I think, in the picture. because the strategy of the West takes that into consideration, but there is no strategy. That's the answer, right? You just destroyed my precipice here. You can dance on the left foot, on the right foot. Strategy of the West will not change because it's lacking, right? Exactly. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist. All right, you touched upon a very other interesting topic, who are Russians. But I think since we've been live for about an hour and a half, yeah, let's dedicate a whole other stream to that. This is a very important topic. All right, dear viewers, we'll talk about the topic of Kiev and Rus. And Yulia, I'll put here a statement to just as a teaser. I'm Russian, but I'm not a Russian citizen. And I'm not citizen of Russian Federation. And moreover, the tragedy of Russian people inhabiting the territory of Russian Federation and other peoples, and Ukraine and neighboring countries, is that there are not too many Russians. There are just too few of them. And you're almost taking some words from the post of my friend Andrei Volna, who is a Russian doctor who ran from Moscow at the beginning of war and found a fantastic way to actually get to Kiev, and he's helping. He's a world-renowned traumatologist expert, and he is saving lives in Kiev after Russian attacks. So from his post, I learned that the main surgeon of Russian military is Ukrainian. Yeah, let's talk about that. Yeah, this guy is in Kiev, and that Ukrainian is in Moscow. Yeah, let's talk about that in 2 to 3 weeks. Do you have time for the last question, Alexey? Of course, because I think the most important question is, what will Putin do in the next few months? Because we often talk about what he achieved and how his army changed, but what fundamental problems and deficiencies are still there? Do you think he will manage to break through the front? From my point of view, this is a hypothesis, but I think his ideation looks like this. He will conduct his theater with elections, and they'll try to take Avdiivka before then as a prize for that event. After that, he'll start cleansing in the Russian elites. He already has this task overly ripened. He needs to shorten the access to power by those in his leadership who have been rather negligent of his figure, and that includes his power in Moscow and regional powers as well, including governors and the like. And that'll be some sort of a pause. It'll take him some time to do that. And the situation on the front might not be changing dramatically at that time. He'll be looking for ways to increase the capability of Russian military in the meantime. They likely will have to draft more people. And the first way would be to get more people, because it takes much longer to get new tanks or new equipment. And they'll try to aggregate more troops and take some more territory, let's say perhaps something like Kupiansk, to present that by the summit of NATO that will be happening in Washington, right? And the most significant results he'll try to get by September, to the beginning of the active election campaign in the United States. His main task would be to blow up any trust, any faith left in the West that there is any need still to help Ukraine, because Ukraine will likely lose this war anyway. And I'm not stating that. I'm saying that this is Putin's task. This is how he sees that. And the second one, I'm not sure if he'll go for that. I think that decision will be made after he is done with cleansing, and if he achieves certain successes in other smaller tasks, he might then go for a provocation within the Baltic countries or Poland, because from my point of view, he will try to connect that towards Trump's elections, and his idea would be to show that NATO is incapable of defending their own positions. For example, if he carries out a smaller attack on Baltic countries, NATO will be failing to defend them. So NATO is incapable, is a broken organization. That would imply creating a very significant crisis in Europe with the NATO countries. That means almost guaranteed victory of Trump and Republicans, isolationists in the United States. And that would imply a change of paradigm in Europe, because many countries of EU after short and brief debates and heated debates about whether they should send Portuguese battalions to defend some country in Eastern Europe where most of Portuguese soldiers don't even know where it exists. And they likely, many of them will gravitate to finding agreement with Russia in the same style that Orban or Fico's government have done. And that would mean the end of NATO in the way we know it. I would also say here, Alexey, that it might be the end of smaller countries, because apparently small countries cannot survive in a military environment when there is a full-scale warfare happening. I agree with you here, Yulia. Yes. Now the question is, will he have enough balls to provoke NATO? I think this is the idea. Will he go for it? I put that as a dependent factor on his success in cleansing and purging those people who are not entirely loyal to his government, who could create obstacles on different levels of his apparatus in Russia, in financial, economic, military, and other spheres. That would somehow affect his strategy if he decides to throw a gauntlet to NATO. So that he can go for. If not, he would be just creating more crisis on the front for us to make sure that all Republicans, all the right wing in the United States would say that, well, it looks like it's another Afghanistan or Iraq. Here we failed our diplomacy again, our external politics. We just need to remove all Democrats from power, all globalists from our power structures. And that's what can happen in America. Okay, so with that, real last question. I had Boris Nadezhdin the day before yesterday, and we already understood that he was not accepted by election commission. They understood that technical candidate all of a sudden became a serious figure, and a lot of forces in Russia put their hopes and expectations on him. After that was bestowed, Putin decided to get rid of him as a competitor. And Nadezhdin was talking in my interview. There was an interesting phrase there. When I asked him about the war, he said immediate ceasefire, right? And I told him that Ukrainian position is known. Withdraw to the borders of 91 and then we can talk. What will you do if you get this offer? He said that he will not give that order. He said that I'm running for president of Russia, not a president of Ukraine. I will cease fire and start negotiations without withdrawing. So now, hypothetical question. We understand that Nadezhdin under no circumstance will become a president, will be even allowed to run the campaign. And we already know position of Zelensky. The offer of immediate ceasefire, how do you think it will be taken by Ukraine? What will ensue? Freeze the conflict, ceasefire? Yulia, this is only a partial question. These questions usually done in packages. Ceasefire is not a result by itself. This is just the initial condition for anything else. So one needs then to look at more details. How would Nadezhdin in this case see the following agreement between sides? How does he see building up the relations again? So we'll need to see the plan in more details before we can discuss anything further. Because ceasefire is just a small initial element. This is, like changing weather. If the weather changed, well, there's one element that changed. That's it. Well, I see ceasefire as a freezing of the conflict along the current front line. I don't know, Yulia. Let's not think for himself. If he wants to debate that, he can bring up the package and we can talk about that. Otherwise, it's just about nothing. It's just a small first step. It was raining, now it's sunny. What next? All right, dear sirs, we announce here that we will be talking next time about a scary question, right? A very scary topic for both sides of the conflict. Yeah, very scary topic with a number of landmines per square kilometer. Ideological landmines is definitely higher than in Surovikin defense line. But we'll try not to avoid any single of those and try to blow every one of them up. And then our next discussion. Alexey, thank you very much. Thank you, our viewers, and you. Till later.